In security, there's always going to be individuals who have excessive access. System administrators, for example. Someone always has to have the keys to the kingdom. So what do we do in that case? We develop compensating controls, which is an access controls, which starts to get into your IT general controls domain and the control side, but it's an extension of security. And that's okay. And there's nothing wrong with developing those compensating controls. But the first step is making sure that we are aware that we have this SOD, aware that we have this concern, make sure it's documented, and then develop a compensating control.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Christian Leva. Christian is an advisory managing director in consulting risk assurance practice at KPMG, and he has worked in all phases of project implementation, including analysis, design, build, and deploy. He has managed the development and deployment of large-scale ERP projects and upgrades, as well as smaller, more specialized teams doing security and control assessment. So Christian, welcome to our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Thank you, Morris, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure too. So Christian, I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the topic of reducing cost of compliance and creating more secure environment through proper security design. But before that, could you tell us a short story about yourself, your career path, what brought you to where you are right now, and what your team at KPMG is up to these days?
Yeah, absolutely. And the journey that I got into doing application security controls is a little bit of an interesting one. So I have had the pleasure of working with a lot of the big consulting firms. I got my start at Accenture, where I was started as a PeopleSoft programmer. They were building up a major team to be able to support a pretty big contract. They were looking for some fresh-faced programmers, and I had done a couple of years in the game development industry, making video games. And they came to me and say, "Hey, do you want to learn how to build PeopleSoft?" I was like, "Well, I don't know what PeopleSoft is, but I'll give it a shot." And as you see, as I'll go through my spiel here, that trend of people asking me to do something I don't know how to do is going to become a theme. But I joined the team, learned everything I could about PeopleSoft and Crystal reports and creating pages and all that kind of stuff for the general ledger, and did that for a few years. And I remember clearly I was on a project, and as we were implementing the project, we were moving into an integration testing phase. And I remember my manager at the time, I was still a young consultant at this time. A manager came in one day and said, "Hey, we need to implement application security." And in true Talladega Nights, he said, "Raise your hand if you want to build security." And I raised my hand. I said, "Well, I want to learn how to do security." So got tapped on the shoulder to learn how to build security for PeopleSoft. And that was a bit of a train wreck for my first 6 months, because it's not exactly something you can or should really dive into without knowing what you're doing. But I stumbled along and got familiar with how to do security and kind of fell in love with that stuff. I fell in love with the concept of it's a careful balance between managing what individuals can do, should do, and really can't do, right? And it reminded me a little bit of the gaming industry. And because one of the aspects I did in gaming is I helped build the AI algorithms for the little characters and what the enemies could and couldn't do. And I learned pretty quickly that it was very easy to make enemies, AI enemies, that are impossible to beat. And it was pretty easy to make AI enemies that were easy to beat. But making them believable in that little middle ground, that was the challenge. And that's kind of what security was for me, and still is. So I got interested in doing that. And then from there, I got picked up by PwC, which was my first intro into the Big Four. Did the same thing there, started to expand more into the compliance side, learning more about controls and audit and SOX and ICFR and everything else. And then had the pleasure of getting picked up by KPMG about 3 years now. I've been with KPMG ever since. And like you mentioned during the intro, My official title is I'm a leader within our advisory risk services GRC application security and compliance group. Long-winded title. That essentially means I have the opportunity to do implementations of security and controls for a variety of application systems, such as Oracle and PeopleSoft and SAP and Workday. And then I have the other opportunity on the other side, being able to develop controls and audit policies and do assurance attestations of those controls on a periodic basis to make sure they're still working. So a bit of a long-winded intro, but that's how I am here today with you.
Let's dive in application security first, because it's kind of what you started from when you was asked to do something that you didn't know. So what are the key considerations for ensuring a robust application layer security, and how does it contribute to protecting against external threats?
Yeah, absolutely. So security, obviously, as you know, is a broad topic, right? And report after report, whether you're talking about audit reports or internal audit reports, the number one concern is always cyber security. And when I introduce myself to folks, they think, oh, okay, well, you work in cybersecurity, you do the hacking stuff and all that cool thing. You're, as they see in the movie, typing on the screens with the matrix looking logos and stuff. But at the end of the day, that's not what I do. I do application layer security. So the way I like to describe it is cybersecurity is all about external threats, managing external threats, making sure that the folks who are not supposed to have access to your systems or to be able to get behind your four walls, they stay out. They're not supposed to have access. Application layer security, on the other hand, is how do we secure the environment from those who are supposed to have access, making sure that those individuals, we have to give them access because they're our employees, or there are external suppliers or contractors or whatever the case may be. But how do we limit what they're able to do so that they're able to do their job, no more, no less? It's the concept of least privilege. So that's what application security is. And as I mentioned in the intro, it's a fine line. It's a delicate dance, if you will, about understanding what are the business requirements? What do folks need to do to be able to do their job? And where do we draw that line about granting too much access? And unfortunately, but at the same time, fortunately, because I have a job because of it, but that this is a part of security that's often overlooked, especially for maybe younger companies or companies that may not be required to have certain regulatory things such as SOX or private equity policies, or wherever the case may be. They may not see the issue or the problem with granting all of their users, say, super user access, or having the provisioning strategy of, hey, make my access look like so and so's, right? I just got hired, make it look like that person, right? And the problem with that is you don't ever really know if you have a problem until you have a problem. You have some type of an event and everything else. And that's where the cyber side comes back in, right? So we've had a lot of notable cyber events in recent years where, through social engineering, for example, we have these events where external threats have gotten access to the environments through social engineering, and now they're logging in as someone else when they're not supposed to. Well, that's where your cyber threat failed because it's social engineering, which is very difficult, to be fair, to prevent against. But once you're in, now that's your application layer strategy. And if they're able to hack into an account and now that account just has super user access, well, you've exponentially made the problem worse. So that's the domain and the area that I work with.
All right. So let's go one step deeper. You said when you people are already supposed to have access, what is the segregation of duties and separation of access means in your situation, and what is the significance in security context? Why should the organization prioritize this?
That's a great question. So at the end of the day, there is a lot of segregation of duty or SOD rules that you could implement. But at the end of the day, there is really kind of a golden rule that you want to keep in mind. And that is you want to separate the individuals who are able to create things. This could be creating new products, item catalogs, invoices, transactions of some kind, right? And segregate that between the individuals who are able to approve those transactions. And the reasoning for that is fairly straightforward. You want to have two sets of eyes before something that impacts you financially goes out the door, just to make sure, either through a simple human error or nefarious reasons, that these transactions are not appropriate for your business. So at the beginning of the day, I could give hundreds of different rules, and sometimes organizations do have hundreds of different SOD rules. But if you were to boil it down, it's really just that. And so a particular specific example is in the financial worlds, right? So being able to create a GL invoice, for example, and making sure that the individual who creates that invoice, puts everything in, is also not the person that approves it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the person who has the ability to create an invoice does not also have the ability to approve an invoice within that same system, right? That's a common misconception. It's just that they shouldn't be able to approve their own invoice. And that's where the security aspects get a little complicated, right? Because that's where it goes with workflow routing and everything else. But that's kind of a simple example of what type of segregation that you should have. But the other side of it is, and I'm sure you might have listeners that are listening to this that think, well, my organization is too small in certain areas where I don't have enough bodies to make that type of segregation. So what do I do? Well, that's the other side of the security. In security, there's always going to be individuals who have excessive access.
Mm-hmm.
System administrators, for example, someone always has to have the keys to the kingdom. So what do we do in that case? We develop compensating controls, which is an access controls, which starts to get into your IT general controls domain and the control side, but it's an extension of security. And that's okay. And there's nothing wrong with developing those compensating controls. But the first step is making sure that we are aware that we have this SOD, aware that we have this concern, make sure it's documented, and then develop a compensated control, which in this case, let's say we have 3 people in our AP world. And whenever we do our PERT POs and everything else, we just do not have enough folks to segregate everything. That's okay. We'll put in an access control to say we're going to periodically look at all of the approved transactions and just check for anomalies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And check, make sure everything's on the up and up, do 3-way matching, whatever the case may be.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, now you explained all these mechanics of the basic of segregation of duties and application layer security. Let's go deep into cost of compliance. How can an organization reduce the cost of compliance based on what you'd explained, and why they have to enhance their security posture through effective security design? Because you said sometimes there is no enough bodies to do all these things. What is your opinion on this?
Yeah, great point. So in the world of compliance, and especially if you have an external auditor who comes in and periodically audits, you have this concept of first, second, and third line of defense, right? And I'm going to grossly simplify it to essentially mean that first and second line are ultimately responsible for making sure that there is security and that there is controls in place to prevent bad things, unintentional things from happening. It is their direct responsibility to stop it at the point of transaction. And then third line, again, gross simplification, is responsible for periodically evaluating the controls that first and second line have put into place to make sure that they're still working as they're supposed to be. So they're kind of an independent pre-audit. They gather up all that evidence, and then the third line sends it off to the external auditors as proof to say, hey, boom, here's what I've done. I mention all of that because it's a great question, and one that I get asked often that says, you know what, I would love to put in incredibly robust security and cyber defenses and do tabletops and do all these things. But at the end of the day, I've got a limited budget and it just doesn't make financial sense. The controls don't necessarily outweigh the risks that they're designed to protect against. So what are ways that I could have a robust thing while reducing cost? And that's what I mean by reducing our cost of compliance. And it's something I work with the clients a lot with is what is that balance? And so the reason I articulate what are the different lines of defense is because we have to look at what are all these lines doing. So first and second line are all about making sure that their controls are continuously trying to catch things that are going wrong. So one way to reduce your cost of compliance is automating how are we doing these controls monitoring on the first and second line. And that's called continuous control monitoring, or CCM. There's a lot of third-party tools out there. There's a lot of managed service providers, et cetera, that allow you to automate that continuous control monitoring. So for example, in the world of security, one way that we could reduce our cost of compliance is having continuous control monitoring of SODs that we were talking about before. So we don't have to necessarily periodically check to see, do we have all of these SODs in place? Instead, let's spend a one-time activity. Let's implement a continuous control monitoring solution to monitor SOD. And again, there's a slew of applications out there, or we could build our own, that says, all right, anytime I provision access, it automatically checks to see if I've done an SOD violation. And if I have, it will provide alternatives or ways to fix it, right? So that's a little bit of an automation there. Then on the third line of it, the biggest cost with trying to do internal audits and test of design and test of effectiveness for your external is usually the process for gathering all the evidence, gathering all the artifacts to see if your controls were actually effective. And so you have to get copies or the data for the invoices and the purchase orders and all this other stuff. And in the realm of security, you have to get evidence that all of these things, all of the design of security was appropriate and that all of the users who have access are appropriate. And the way that we do that from a third line is through user access reviews or privileged access reviews, sometimes called UARs or PARs. That's the most common mechanism to confirm the appropriateness of access. And usually external auditors will ask that you do that on a routine basis. Well, that process alone is usually pretty complicated. I've heard stories that it takes 6 to 8 weeks on average to do a UAR for 4 or 5 application systems that might be in scope. And if you're doing this every quarter, that starts to add up. You've got somebody that's pretty much doing these things full time. So that is a particular area that we look to automate. And again, plenty of third-party solutions out there that can help automate that. But the core of it is making sure that there's a connection between how do we provision access the very first time, making sure that there is an appropriateness review at the point of provisioning. And then there's a monitoring process in place that monitors if any of that access that was approved the first time has changed, and then simply monitor and attest on those changes. That is one simple way to make that process extremely easier and more time efficient by simply reviewing the deltas versus doing a net new evaluation from scratch every single time. So those are a handful of examples, but the point is that, and I've mentioned a few times that there's plenty of third-party tools that do all of this, but we also can't forget that the most effective way of reducing cost of compliance is looking at the processes themselves and seeing if we can streamline those processes, right? At KPMG, we believe in every problem has a solution that falls into a people, process, or technology domain, right? And usually you have to have all three. And technology, if you just buy a fancy new tool, but you don't fix your processes, you're not going to get as effective. So the best way to reduce your cost of compliance, take a look at your processes that you have in place across your first and third line and see if we can rethink how we're doing them to ideally eliminate the process altogether because we don't need it. Then once you have that, then plug in some technology to further automate it after that.
No, fantastic. Yeah, it was a long explanation, but I think it was worth it.
Yeah. I never said I was a short-winded responder. I love to hear myself talk sometimes, so I'll always give you a long response.
So now I would like to ask you a personal point of view. What is the major misconception in your field of operational security that you kind of strongly disagree with?
Wow. Okay. Wow, that is a great question and one that I've not been asked recently. So what is a big misconception? Man, okay. I have some very specific ones. So in the world of our SaaS applications today, things like Oracle, SAP, Workday, Salesforce, etc. These applications are changing all the time. In the case of Oracle, it changes 4 times a year. Salesforce, I think they're down to 2 or 3 releases every year. But something that is constantly changing with all of these is the way that security is structured under the hood. And so for years, consulting firms and sometimes even security experts have said that in order to stay ahead of your application security changes, you have to make sure you fully customize your entire security architecture and don't use anything straight out of the box. So there's 2 issues with that. Number one, I absolutely 100% agree, and this would be my second answer to your question, is that you should very rarely, if ever, use the security roles that come straight out of the box from any ERP system. They almost always contain way more access than they're supposed to, and that's intentional, right? For Oracle, for example, when you first are standing it up, it's absolutely okay to assign individuals these seated roles to get an idea of what are the functionalities of the system. That's what they're there for. But once you understand the functionality of the system, then you need to tailor those roles, start taking things away to make it align with what your users actually need to be able to do. But there's a fine line to that. And this is the second part of the answer. That doesn't mean that everything needs to be 100% custom either. That's making a little bit too much work for you. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with using roles that are built straight out of the box, as long as they're not providing excessive access or providing SODs. And the misconception that has always been there is that when these systems get updated, then if you haven't customized your roles and you're using seated roles, well, those are going to get updated with it, but your custom roles won't. That's just not correct, right? And the reasoning, it's a simple kind of explanation. It gets a little bit technical, but when things like Oracle, when those systems are updated, they're adding or removing or changing the entitlements or privileges, which is the most bottom layer of security. So when those things get changed, they're just being, again, probably removed and new ones are being added. If an entitlement is removed, it doesn't matter if you have a seated role or a custom role. It's no longer there. So that's a scenario where even your custom roles are going to be impacted. So giving you a shorter wind answer, I guess the most common thing that I feel is a big misconception in the application security world, especially with the applications, is thinking that it's okay to use the roles that come with the system straight out of the box and not tailoring them to fit your own business need. At the same time, making sure you're not completely writing things from scratch either, because you're just going to create more work for yourself.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I used to be myself, well, 20 or 30 years ago, a software engineer, and I remember was a first ERP system or something, GD Edwards, if you know, on
Yeah.
S400, they also have something kind of standard roles, and we always struggled with this. So because probably now it's kind of much better, but yeah, I remember these questions were asked very often. So, Christian, if we summarize our interview for someone who's listening and would like to walk away with one or two major takeaways, what would it be?
So I would say if you are in the process of evaluating a new application system, whether it be the first time you're implementing an ERP system, or maybe you have a legacy system like an on-prem JDE or PeopleSoft, or whatever the case may be, and you want to move to a new system, there's a few things that are probably top of mind, and rightly so. There are things such as, how is this going to make my business better? Is this going to make the tasks that my people do more efficient? Is it going to make our lives better? And is there going to be a positive ROI on this investment? Once you have made that business decision, you then put together your list of requirements and you start sending out RFPs, requests for proposals, to various SIs and consultants, asking them to come and put a bid on how much it would take to implement this new system. What I would want folks to leave with is that you should absolutely consider and put at the top of your priority the business value of implementing this system. But the most commonly overlooked thing that I see when you're starting this journey is, how does this impact from a security and a compliance perspective? Is implementing this new system to replace legacy manual processes, is this system now going to be in scope for SOX? Or how am I going to manage the security? Or am I comfortable with my existing control processes? If you have any of these questions, my only ask would be, put these requirements in your RFP. Start challenging your SIs and your consultants to answer these questions for you. And then you'll start to see that there's a lot of opportunities, if you ask the questions early, to be able to not just get an ROI and a return on your investment from the business of implementing a system to make your business processes better, but you're also going to be able to take advantage of the latest technology to make your compliance processes better and ultimately reduce your compliance there. So that would be my biggest takeaway. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be if you're starting a transformation. If you've already done one recently within the last year or so, and you have, after listening to us today, if you have questions of, you know what, I think we did actually put seated roles in there. Do I have an issue, right? Give me a call, reach out to me on LinkedIn, or reach out to your trusted advisor, whoever that might be, and say, hey, I heard this guy talking on a podcast about using seated roles. I now have a concern. Simply asking the question is a great first step. And then you'd be amazed at what you might be able to learn. And it's not necessarily going to mean it's an extra cost. It just means that you have an opportunity to further secure your environment and potentially make things a little bit more effective and put some dollars back in your pocket from a compliance activities.
Fantastic. All right. That's were all my questions. Perhaps if you would like to add something that I forgot to ask you, if you feel something important for our audience.
No, I think I've chatted your ear off enough already. But I will say, Boris, I've always been a big fan of your podcast and the risk community that you've created. So I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be a guest on your show today. And I hope that you and I are able to further collaborate on some other things in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Christian.
Mm-hmm.